examples of wasted dollars at a time when the
senators today working on a measure that would provide training for veterans who are looking for civilian jobs and give them priority in hiring for federal jobs. Now, members return for a vote to move the measure forward.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch,
No.
Mr. Hoven, McCain, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, yes, sir, I do. Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bingaman, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coates, Cochran, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Heller, Isaacson, Klobuchar, Kyle, Leahy, Manchin, McCain, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Rockefeller, Sanders, Sessions, Tester, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, and Warner. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch. Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Coburn, Inhofe, and Paul. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye.
To move this.
Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye.
I hope so. I think so. One more hurdle. I think so.
Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Dement. No. Mr. Dement, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Ms. Snow? Ms. Snow? Aye. Mr. Kaka? Mr. Kaka? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Lieberman? Mr. Lieberman? Aye.
Hello, ladies. Looks like
Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye.
You better pack a lunch.
Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye.
Are there any other senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? Hearing none, the ayes are 84, nays are 8. The motion to proceed is agreed to.
President, I couldn't hear the number. What was it?
The ayes are 84 and the nays are 8.
Mr. President?
The majority leader. Order in the chamber, please.
On behalf of Senator Murray, I call substitute amendment number 2789 to the attention of the chair.
The clerk will report the bill.
Calendar number 476, S3457, a bill to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to establish a Veterans Job Corps and for other purposes.
The clerk will report the amendment.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, for Mrs. Murray, proposes an amendment number 2789.
On this, Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. Yeas and nays are ordered.
I have now, Mr. President, a first-degree perfecting amendment, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2808 to amendment number 2789.
Mr. President, on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I now have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment 2809 to amendment number 2808.
I have a cloture motion on the substitute amendment, Mr. President. It is at the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on the substitute amendment number 2789 to S. 3457, a bill to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to establish a Veterans Job Corps and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators as follows: Reed of Nevada, Nelson of Florida, Levin, Harkin, Bingaman, Coons, Gillibrand, Leahy, Sanders, Inouye, Cardin, Franken, Boxer, Wyden, Menendez, Casey, and Mikulski.
Mr. President, I have an amendment at the desk to the language that's proposed to be stricken.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2810 to the language proposed to be stricken by amendment number 2789.
I ask for yeas and nays on that amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. Yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2811 to amendment number 2810.
Mr. President, I have a motion to commit with instructions.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, moves to commit the bill as 3457 to the Committee on Veterans Affairs with instructions to report back forthwith the following amendment numbered 2812.
Ask for yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second?
Raise your hand. Raise your hand.
There appears to be. There is.
I have an amendment.
Yeas and nays are ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have an amendment to the instructions. They've been filed at the desk. That has been filed at the desk.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment number 2813 to the instructions of amendment 2812 to commit as 3457.
Ask for the yeas and nays on that, Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2814 to amendment number 2813.
I have a motion, cloture motion to the bill, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on S. 3457, a bill to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to establish a Veterans Job Corps and for other purposes. Signed by
President, I would ask
senators.
that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask consent the mandatory quorum required under Rule 22 be waived for the cloture motions just filed.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
I now move to proceed to calendar number 499, S3521.
The clerk will report the motion to proceed.
S3521.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 499, S3521, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to extend certain expiring provisions.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
now that the Senate has finally adopted the motion to proceed to the Veterans Jobs Bill, we've brought to a close the 380th filibuster during my time as Majority Leader. Less than 6 years. And just now, to start to bring debate to a close on the Veterans Jobs Bill itself, I've had to file the 381st cloture petition during my 5.5 years as leader. That's 381 cloture motions filed in just 6 years. Actually, it's less than that, Mr. President. For comparison, the 6 years that Lyndon Johnson was Majority Leader, he had to file 1 cloture motion. This has become outrageous, Mr. President. The people's time being wasted. We just finished 30 hours of nothing. We're now starting our next 30 hours of nothing. Just standing around looking at each other. Filibusters have increased in recent years, but this is really unbelievable what has happened. The level of Republican obstruction has increased dramatically. It's increased dramatically just in the last few years. Mr. President, we don't have a fight over everything. A Veterans Jobs Bill, does that deserve a fight? When we were in recess, subject called the chair, the Afghan veteran was brought here. He's missing one leg. He's 25 years old. He's an Army veteran. He's trying to hang on to his other leg. Mr. President, I wanted the pages who were in here, I called them up, introduced them to this young man. I wanted them to see what all this talk is about, of people who sacrifice for our country. This man, hopefully he'll be well and after some more rehabilitation time, that he can go out and look for a job. He'll have at least one artificial limb. This is a Veterans Jobs Bill that is being held up for what reason? I don't know. Or do I know? The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports there are about 200,000 unemployed post-9/11 veterans, approaching 250,000. And as the nation appropriately winds down our military commitments abroad, we can expect increased numbers of newly separated veterans to enter the workforce. The Veterans Jobs Bill is a $1 billion investment in our veterans. This bill would increase training and hiring opportunities for veterans. It would help to create jobs for vets. I commend Senator Nelson of Florida and the chairman of the Veterans Committee, Senator Murray, for their hard work on this bill. Unfortunately, I've already received word that the senators, Republican senators, are simply unwilling to pass this measure. One Republican senator, for example, is insisting on a vote on something relating to Pakistan. Another senator has filed a right-to-work amendment. And yet another Republican senator has filed the Department of Defense authorization bill as an amendment to this bill. As important as Pakistan and many other issues are, the Senate ought to be able to focus on this young man who was here in the well this evening. We ought to be focused on creating jobs for veterans. Now, we all know what's happening over here. The Republican leader, you have to admire him, he stuck to it. His #1 goal is to defeat President Obama. And that's why we haven't been able to legislate. Everything has been stopped. Everything. We've been able to push through a few things, but not many. As always, I will do everything I can to work with senators to get consent agreements to provide for consideration of this legislation. Hope that we can reach such agreement on this. I don't have much hope, but I'm always, I guess, hopeful. But in the meantime, I'll do what I need to do to ensure that the Senate can vote on this important measure. I'll do what we can to help create jobs for America's veterans. We need to do it for everyone. But couldn't we just agree on veterans? I know that now we're 30 hours post-cloture. We all know the drill. Scores and scores of times. The presiding officer is a new member of this Senate, relatively new. Served here going on 2 Congresses. But he's an expert at watching this. The senator from Oregon has watched this, and he understands what's going on. And it's not very good. So the time will run out on this, 30 hours from whenever the vote was turned in. But we, first of all, Mr. President, we just, Mr. President, it's easy to get, especially when I'm used to the math, the Ryan math, you get mixed up on numbers a little bit. So let's go back where we are. We just completed a wasted 30 hours. I had to file cloture now on the underlying bill. I've done that. Now we have to wait 2 days for this to ripen. The 2 days is going to expire on Friday. Now, we are going to vote on Friday, but it's not going to be at a time convenient to everybody. We're going to come in shortly after midnight tomorrow night. We're going to vote on this. And then the 30 hours can start running then. And then we'll vote Saturday again. If people cannot work together to help veterans, then we're going to make sure the American public knows what's going on here. So we won't vote tomorrow night, but we will vote. We'll vote. It has to be any time 2 days from now, and we can do that tomorrow night, Mr. President. Actually, Friday morning. Early, a little after midnight. And I'm sorry I got a little mixed up on the 30 hours, 2 days for something to ripen. And then, as I said, I've been very confused because of the Ryan math. It's really been difficult for me to accept all that.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky.
Where to start? I mean, what a charade and what a farce. The majority filibusters their own bills. They fill up the amendment tree. They don't even pretend like they're going to work with the other side. How do you expect to pass legislation if you won't allow any input from the other party? A charade and a farce. As far as helping that young veteran, our soldiers went to war in Afghanistan to get bin Laden. We finally got bin Laden, and we got him with the help of Dr. Shakil Afridi. I don't see one peep from the other side. I don't see one bit of concern for the man who helped get bin Laden. Our soldiers went to Afghanistan. That young man lost a limb. A young man in my town also lost 3 limbs. They did it to get this horrible mass murderer, bin Laden. This happened, and this is why we went to war, and we're going to do nothing to support the man who helped us get bin Laden. We send good money after bad. Billions of dollars have been squandered in Pakistan. Pakistan then tortures the man who helped America get bin Laden, and we do nothing. I've asked for 15 minutes to vote on this issue. 15 minutes. No one's obstructing this for any sort of personal vendetta. I'm more than happy to work with the majority. I care deeply about the veterans. I care deeply about housing and helping the veterans who have fought for their country. But this is about whether or not we as a country and the American taxpayers will be asked to send good money after bad to allies that are not acting like allies. Today we are reminded that our enemies are relentless. But we are also reminded that our so-called allies are not acting like allies at all. We are saddened by the assassination of Ambassador Stevens and his fellow workers. And we are appalled by the lack of protection for our embassies by our supposed allies. We send billions of taxpayer dollars abroad, and what do we get in return? Disrespect, disdain, and now ultimately violence. I have two amendments that I wish to call down. First, not one penny should be sent to Libya until the assassins are delivered to justice. Not one penny should go to Egypt until they guarantee the safety and protection of our embassies. And second, not one more penny should go to Pakistan until the doctor who helped us get bin Laden is freed. Is it too much to ask of the Senate? I'm more than willing to cooperate. I'm more than willing to let those go home who want to go home and campaign. I know it's going to be a tough election for the other side, but the thing is, I'm more than willing to let you go home anytime. I do this because it's important that our allies act like allies. It's important that we have a vote, that this Senate go on record and say, do you support the American taxpayer? Do you want to help the man who helped us get bin Laden? And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendments and call up Amendment 2783 and also another amendment that is at the desk and yet to be numbered.
Is there an objection? Majority Leader? Objection is heard.
I don't think President.
Majority Leader.
The Senator from Kentucky says that there's no input from the minority, but in fact, the substitute amendment we're going to vote on in the next day or two, this is now pending before us, has numerous provisions authored by Senate Republicans. I respect the Senator from Kentucky's interest in the relations with Pakistan, Egypt, and Libya, but every now and then the Senate should be able to focus on a small good thing. To veterans, this is a big thing, like helping them. And so I understand my friend's tenacity, but I understand also how the Senate operates, and I just think that my friend from Kentucky maybe should have been run for Secretary of State rather than the Senate.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
I ask consent the call to quorum be terminated.
The Majority Leader.
I now ask that we proceed to period of morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you. I now ask unanimous consent that we proceed to period of morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to H.R. 6336.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 6336, an act to direct the Joint Committee on the Library to accept a statue depicting Frederick Douglass from the District of Columbia and to provide for a permanent display of the statue in Emancipation Hall of the United States Capitol.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the bill be read 3 times passed. Most we consider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate. Any statements related to this matter be placed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
I now ask consent the Senate proceed to S.Res. 551.
The clerk will report.
S.Res. 551, commending the 4 American public servants who died in Benghazi, Libya, including Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens, for their tireless efforts on behalf of the American people and condemning the violent attack on the United States consulate in Benghazi.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Mr. President, I now ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion reconsidered be laid on the table, there be no intervening action or debate, and that all senators be added as co-sponsors to the resolution, and that any statements related to this matter be printed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
I now ask consent the Senate proceed to S.Res. 552.
The clerk will report.
S.Res. 552, recognizing the month of October 2012 as National Principals Month.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, motion reconsidered be laid on the table, there be no intervening action or debate. Any statements related to this matter be printed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
I now ask that we proceed to S.Res. 553.
The clerk will report.
S.Res. 553, designating September 22, 2012 as National Falls Prevention Awareness Day to raise awareness and encourage the prevention of falls among older adults.
Is there an objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion reconsidered be laid on the table, there be no intervening action or debate, and any related statements be printed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate, when it completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Thursday, September 13th. Following the prayer and the pledge, adjourned proceedings be approved today. The morning hour be deemed expired, and the time for the 2 leaders be reserved for the use later in the day. That the majority leader be recognized, and the first hour, when we come in, that I be recognized, and that the first hour be equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or the designees, with the majority controlling the first half, Republicans the final half.
Without objection.
This evening, the majority, I filed cloture on the substitute amendment to the Veterans Jobs Bill and the underlying bill. As a result, the filing deadline for first-degree amendments to the substitute is 1 p.m. tomorrow. Under the rule, the cloture votes in relation to the Veterans Jobs Bill will occur on Friday. I talked about that earlier this evening. We'll decide what time we're going to do that tomorrow. We hope we can reach an agreement to have the vote or votes tomorrow. And if not, Mr. President, full-time as usual, we'll be voting this weekend, including tomorrow, late at night. If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask to adjourn under previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.